Welcome to the podcast. Today we're talking with Brian Jones and Brian Poirier of Liberty Mutual. Liberty Mutual is one of the largest companies on the planet. They're ranked 75th on the Fortune 100 list of largest companies, and they've been around since 1912. One thing that's clear to me after this conversation is that Liberty Mutual is a company that embraces change. And from our discussion with Brian and Brian, it's clear that they embrace technology to do that. We get into some details about their stack, what technology they're using, and how they're transitioning from an on-premises, largely an on-premises application environment to one that incorporates elements in the cloud like MongoDB Atlas. It was a fascinating discussion. I learned a ton, and I know that Nick and I enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do too.
You're listening to the MongoDB Podcast. MongoDB Podcast? Exploring the world of software development, data, and all things MongoDB. And now your hosts, Michael Lynn and Nick Raboy.
Welcome, folks.
Yeah, thanks. How you doing?
Well, it's great to have you on the podcast. Brian Poirier, would you give us a bit of an intro?
Yeah, how you doing, Mike? My name's Brian Poirier. I've been with Liberty Mutual for about 5 years. I'm a senior infrastructure engineer. Been working with MongoDB pretty much since we've incorporated at the company, and from the beginning of our on-prem up into what we've done in EC2 and now with our integration into Atlas.
And I know we've spent some time together at some of the events. You've done some speaking for MongoDB, is that correct?
Correct. We were on the MongoDB Live podcast earlier this summer, talking about some of the issues we worked with working through MongoDB to incorporate into Atlas.
Oh, great. And Brian Jones, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Brian Jones. I'm an architect at Liberty Mutual. I work in our shared service organization that we call Global Digital Services. Really focused on the developer experience and deploying databases and taking care of them and all things that go into that. So glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
So shared services, that's an interesting area. I spent some time at Merrill Lynch and Bank of America in a very similar role, working in shared services architecture role. So I imagine we've done quite a similar role. And I'd like to get to that. But before we do, both of you mentioned that you've been working with MongoDB for quite some time. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with MongoDB at Liberty Mutual today?
Well, we've kind of started with a lot of our on-prem instances, and with microservice architectures, it grew pretty rapidly. We hit pretty much a scaling issue where we weren't able to move as fast as our developers were kind of hoping. And we just couldn't bring in features that we wanted for doing things like sharding or some other high-tech stuff we couldn't do. Moved into EC2, where we found it was great, gave us more flexibility, more integration with cloud services. However, managing the operating system components and all the other facets of a cloud EC2 instance just kind of held us back, which brought in Atlas. So we're just now really starting to take off with Atlas, and we're looking pretty good. We're looking for a pretty rapid uptake.
When you were having issues with sharding and scaling, things like that, how long were you in the evaluation process, would you figure, before you decided, Atlas is a potential win for us?
We had a couple app teams that were very interested in sharding, but we couldn't figure out how to do the backups and recovery and the encryption piece. So we decided that our on-prem just wouldn't handle it. So it was a pretty quick decision right there. At the time, I remember Atlas had just come online. So it's about 2.5 years ago, roughly. And we immediately saw that there is potential where we could scale up to these big applications that could take use of sharding that we just couldn't do with our on-prem instances.
And for the folks listening that may be wondering, sharding, we obviously know who Liberty Mutual is, a large insurance company. But when we talk about sharding, we're talking about partitioning the databases, right? And this is typically done for scalability, to scale to large database instance sizes. So we divide the data up across many different, we scale horizontally across many different clusters, and that can be a challenge when you're running on-prem. And when we talk about scaling, what are we talking about in terms of the size of these databases? How large are they? Are you comfortable talking about that?
Well, a lot of our on-prem instances, like I said, was based kind of on microservice architectures where we had many databases running many different applications. So though we have a lot of replica sets, data sizes float around 200 gigabytes roughly as some of our larger databases. Some of the smaller ones, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but that's kind of where our on-prems developed.
Now, we typically say the rule of thumb is when you start to look at database sizes in the terabytes, 1 to 2 terabytes, that's when we typically say you want to start looking at sharding. But that's just a general rule of thumb. And I'm imagining that because you're using a microservice architecture, that those numbers would probably come down. Is that a correct assumption?
You mean if numbers would come down if...
Yeah, you would probably look to shard at a much lower number in a microservice architecture as opposed to, one server per database.
I see what you're saying. In a microservice architecture, we could see those numbers come down because we could spread the load to different areas based on where the data lives. So kind of where we have our 2 data centers right now, that we haven't been able to really do something like that. So we're kind of stuck with this monolithic approach, I guess you could say. We can't spread to different availability zones. We can't horizontally scale out at the moment. So yes, we do think those numbers can come down with a microservice architecture because we can basically put the data where we need it.
So in regards to your servers, first of all, I want to maybe take a step back. Is Liberty Mutual only in the United States, or is it distributed globally?
We're a global company, absolutely.
So with that in mind, I mean, how many servers would you say that you have, and what kind of distribution are you using for those servers?
Currently, all of our on-prems live in 2 data centers in the United States. Application teams are all over the world, but for our on-prem Mongo environment, they're stuck in our 2 data centers, which brings in latency issues. If we have someone in Europe that's trying to do work, they definitely hit that. And again, that's where we're looking to something where if we could put the data where our developers are, where our customers are, we could overcome some of these issues.
And in terms of the rationale for moving to Atlas, scalability is certainly one. Are there other factors from a business perspective that led you to leveraging MongoDB Atlas?
Absolutely. When we were looking at Atlas, we have a big focus right now of moving to the cloud, like many enterprises across the IT world right now. So we're definitely MongoDB is definitely a very popular service, and we realized to make a better offering for our customers, we have to look to something like Atlas, because having a resource to take care of the myriad of resources that make the database, having a partner that kind of can help us with support issues, that's really what we're looking for with Atlas.
So what else is in this stack? I mean, we've got Atlas as our data layer. We're working off of microservices. What are you using to interact with MongoDB?
Yeah, like the drivers. Are your application teams well versed in using the driver stack? Are you using Node.js? Using
correct? Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Spring Boot, Java, Python. We run the gamut. Pretty much all the standard offerings that we have applications built in that. But from what I've seen, the most popular seems to be Spring Boot. The Spring Boot using, not with Atlas right now, but with our on-prem. And we're actually working with a couple teams now to incorporate that into Atlas.
And what we find is when we talk to folks like yourselves in the larger enterprise space, there's often this pull effect where developers get to the solution of MongoDB before some of the hosting and central architecture teams. Did you find that at all? Were folks leveraging MongoDB before you created the shared services plan?
The shadow IT. We did have a shadow IT, and when Mongo was first on the scene, a lot of developers were playing with it and have the little server set up under your desk running running Mongo or something like that. And as Mongo grew and more features were added, that's where we find ourselves now. And I go back to things like sharding, where developers want something, they want this capability to expand out, but we just don't have that with our on-prem infrastructure. But yes, that is something we try to give our developers what they need and what they want, and we try to meet that need and try to anticipate it. And that's another area we think Atlas basically has everything built into it that they would want to use.
Now, what about the CI/CD, the pipelines, and the infrastructure as cloud? Are you doing anything in that space?
Yeah, we're doing a ton of stuff in that space. We use Atlassian tools to deploy our pipelines, and so we've incorporated Hashicorp Terraform as part of the deployment process. We've got other thing, like we have just the REST API calls that if Terraform doesn't do it yet, we're using REST API calls to do some of that, all the way from project creation, all the way through cluster creation, VPC endpoints.
So I want to slow you down just a second. When you say that's okay, no, it's great stuff. When you say project creation, are you talking about Atlas project creation?
Yep.
So you're leveraging the MongoDB Atlas API to reach into Atlas and trigger the project builds and the cluster deployments.
Yep, that's right. So we've written some code internally to be able to map people to the right organizations within Mongo. So we have certain organizations for certain parts of our business segments, and so we're able to, with some of our internal tools, know which segments which organizations they map to, and allow them to create their projects in the right place, so they don't have to come directly to the DBAs to say, hey, can you create me a project and an API key and stuff to be able to communicate with that project.
Are you leveraging like Active Directory or groups? How do you determine when someone internally goes to trigger a build, what level of access and groups they are in Atlas?
Yeah, so part of our shared services organization has a lot of metadata around our organization. And so we know that if they pick what organization they're in, right? And internal, we have a term called organization too. And so we know that when they deploy or when they create an artifact in our CI/CD pipelines, they are tied to this organization. So we're mapping Atlas organizations into our internal organizations from a metadata standpoint, and we're able to let them go into the right places.
So, I mean, I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but these scripts that you have for deployments, is this something that so if the developer needs to deploy Atlas, are they doing this, or are you doing this? Where's the separation?
Yeah, so so most of our developers don't really care about all the internals of creating a database. If you go ask them, they'll say, hey, can I just get a Mongo Atlas database and give you a little bit of information, fill out a few fields, hit the build and deploy, and off it goes, right? So what we've done is we've built all of the backend stuff for them, and in their deployments, it will pull in our standard scripts, Terraform stuff, REST API calls, CloudFormation templates to create AWS stuff in our accounts, and it will go just pull that for them and run the deploy. And all they have to, at a minimum, all they have to put in is the size of their instance they want. We pull in metadata about their project, like names and things like that. So it's all variable driven, and it just goes and does their stuff. So really simple. It has good and bad, right? So some of the developer community is super interested in all of the bells and whistles and add-ons and things like that. And so they typically don't like this whole, like, hey, just I want to know, I want to be able to change stuff, right? And so so that isn't built in yet, right? If we need to add a feature, or we haven't built in sharding yet or multi-region deployments yet into the process, it's not available to them through this process. But for the most part, they can ask us, we'll put it together, make it available for them, and it'll be available in a little bit of time. So, but for most of the development community we have, it works really well. We're really excited about it.
And I think it's you almost have to take this approach where it's almost like an 80-20, where you satisfy the requirements of the masses, and there's always going to be outliers. Remember that struggle very well. I'm curious about what it was like before. Like, if I'm a developer in Liberty Mutual and I want to deploy infrastructure for a new application I'm starting. What was it like before, and what is it like today? What's the business impact on developers?
Well, for on-prem, it was pretty much a manual process. We'd get a ticket in as a DBA from an application team. After a couple of approvals here and there, that would take about a day. Allocating, provisioning, and having everything ready would take another day. So generally a 2 to 3 day turnaround time when we received the ticket. So with our CI/CD pipelines, we aim to basically say, here you go, do what you need. Run into an issue, we'll help you out or whatever. But it was a really manual process.
And are these pipelines, do they take care of any kind of upgrades to MongoDB Atlas as well? Given that Liberty Mutual is a pretty enormous company, I mean, what does an Atlas upgrade look like using all of these scripts that you're using now?
Yeah, so super excited to be able to put upgrades in the hands of the developers through this process, right? So right now, as far as I know, we've done it from like 4.2 to 4.4 through this process. It is a 1 character change in a property file or a manifest file, right? And so you go from 4.2, you change it to 4.4, you build it, you deploy it. Mongo does its stuff behind the scenes for us, and you get a updated version with all the latest features of Mongo, right? So super cool, super excited. Compared to the on-prem where we still have 2.6 and 3.0 and 3.2 and 3.4 running, and anybody that wants to upgrade has to come talk to a DBA to do it, right? And so super excited for the flexibility of the managed space in this area for sure.
So when you're making that 1 character change from say 4.2 to 4.4, is this change happening for all clusters that you currently manage, or is it working for only new clusters? And I mean, is there any kind of downtime when that happens as well?
Yeah, so this is on a per cluster deployment, right? So application teams or developers are in charge of their own clusters and their own projects. And so we can do defaults for when they create a new project in our CI/CD space, and it will default them to the latest. But to get to the upgrade process, they have to go in and change their file for that deployment or that environment, redeploy it. I haven't done a lot of them, and the database I had was small, right? But going through it was quick. I believed it rolled through the different nodes as part of the different members in the cluster, and minimal downtime through that. So super, super cool and excited to see it.
Yeah, and that's precisely the way Atlas does those upgrades, minimal downtime, rolling across the individual nodes in each cluster. And I would imagine that Liberty has an SDLC, a software development lifecycle, where you have dev. They do that first in dev. They test the code, and they roll into maybe a user acceptance testing or QA environment. What's that look like from an SDLC perspective?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We have dev through prod, dev, QA has different names, QA, test, whatever, staging. We have performance environments, and then production. And then each one of them has a deployment associated with it, so they can control those versions up through the life cycle of the application and database.
So I imagine the glue that holds this all together is the CI/CD pipelines and the stack of technology that's in there. Are you leveraging the MongoDB connector for Terraform?
Yeah, for sure. When we first got into this endeavor with Atlas and started looking at how we were going to deploy this through code and through our pipelines, we were going to have to use all the REST APIs a couple years ago. Really wasn't something that I wanted to deal with. Trying to figure out what changed in these property files and adjust them with the REST APIs wasn't something that I was real excited about. And so we reached out to Mongo and found a community one that somebody had put together for Terraform and said, hey, this thing's been downloaded like 10,000 or 100,000 times. So people were definitely into it, but it didn't have all of the latest. It hadn't been touched in a while, right? And so I think Mongo kind of said, hey, let's tap into that and let's build it and actually work with Hashicorp to make it an official connector, right? And so we're not creating the project yet. We're doing that with an API call, but we are creating the cluster and configuring encryption at rest and alerting and all of that kind of stuff with it. And it's really, really neat to kind of see it work and do all the magic for us so we don't have to figure out under the covers.
Yeah. So speaking of, you mentioned encryption. Speaking of security, Hashicorp, phenomenal company. Those guys are doing some amazing things. Are you using Vault at all?
Yeah, that is like the last piece of the puzzle, right? So once you get everything created, you still have to get access to the database. And so I always used to complain, even as a DBA, on-prem, our developers would ask for we'd do a ticket to create a database. We get the database created for them, and then most of our databases on-prem, they'd say, okay, I need a user. Well, we're not allowed to create users. You guys have to go do another ticket to get a user created in the database that you just asked for. And so, and you have to create a group because you have to do groups, and you have to do another request for IDs and get access to stuff. And so it was just a really horrific process. And so we didn't want to carry that forward into Atlas. And so most of our cloud databases today are using Hashicorp Vault. And so what that allows us to do with some internal stuff that we've written also, using some of that metadata that I talk about, is that we're able to, as part of our deployment process, register the Atlas database with our Hashicorp Vault product. And it gives the project ID and the API credentials to Vault so that when we say, hey, I need a read ID, it goes out and dynamically creates one, sends back the credentials to you, and you can use those to do your stuff, right? And so we've built the ability to get credentials into our role-based access controls based on whatever groups you're in, an AD or LDAP, to say, hey, this organization deployed this database. I am now able to go and hit this button to go get me a read credential or a read write credential, and it has a time to live on it and only exists for whatever time to live we give it for that role. Even better is we're able to say in the pipeline, and this isn't a Vault thing, this is something we built into it, but we're able to say, hey, this application or this database was deployed by this pipeline. Inside this pipeline, I'm going to tell it this other pipeline can get read credentials into my database or read write credentials into my database. So when the app deploys, it calls Vault and says, give me the credentials of the database I need access to, and will automatically create a read write credential every time they deploy their application. And so super excited to not have to do some kind of Jira ticket or request into another team to go get access to a database that I should already have access to. So we're super excited for that.
Like Terraform too, that came about as an open source project, and we were actually working with Mongo Professional Services, and it's something we brought to Mongo and said, wouldn't it be great if we could incorporate this in Atlas? And Mongo picked up the torch, kind of listened to what we were asking for, and brought that in, and it's a huge win. Huge
Fantastic.
win for us.
I'm amazed. I mean, you've really embraced the technology, and it sounds like a really tight partnership with not only MongoDB but other technology partners. I'm curious, were you asked by your leadership teams to quantify this? It sounds like you're saving literally man days per deployment.
In the early days of cloud databases, we did quantify this. We've probably stopped quantifying every database that we deploy now, right? Because they're tired of hearing it. They're like, yeah, we know you can do this. Great, thanks. But in the early days, we were going from, especially in the relational world, right? Going from month or two to get a fully deployed app and database, right? Down to an hour or less now, right? And so we're taking advantage of a lot of the hard work we did a couple years ago and applying that to Atlas now. And so we don't quantify it anymore for the most part because we've already kind of done it in other spaces.
So I guess there's a level of trust at this point when you make a recommendation around a piece of technology. I imagine it carries a lot of weight.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah.
So far, this has been a pretty great discussion on how you're leveraging MongoDB at Liberty Mutual. Are you able to share some information on where you're going next? So what's coming up next in that pipeline of yours over there?
Well, we're getting to the point where we're ready to really introduce this and let the product start to take off. Some of the things we're looking at right now is single sign-on integration with Active Directory to control role base. Right now, it's a pretty manual process where if a dev team needs access to something, I pretty much have to give it to them. And we're hoping to work with Mongo into that next piece.
Yeah. So what the goal of that would be was we already have in our metadata these roles that we talked about earlier that kind of tie and let them get access to the database, but we don't have anything that goes based on those roles and give them access into the Atlas console. So doing the role-based access would allow us to not have to go do manual grants inside the Atlas console to let these developers get access to the stuff they've deployed.
And what we're finding right now too is we actually have to sit down and work on the business rules on what types of access we're going to give, to when, what types of limits, who has the ultimate Atlas privileges, stuff like that. So there are a lot of business rules we actually have to work on too. And I point that out to any enterprise going into Atlas. That's an important thing to consider before starting, because now we're finding, great, we have all this stuff, we got all these people in, now we got to start taking things away as the scope was creeping through the development process.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, that touches on something that I think is important to cover. Suggestions for other maybe architects or central hosting services folks out there looking at the similar type of journey. Like, what suggestions would you have for them going down the same path?
They definitely want to work on those business rules. What type of access do you need? Understanding the difference between console access and database access, how credentials are going to get managed if you're going to be using single sign-on. So definitely that conversation before really diving in. When we started, a lot of these features weren't in Atlas. We were able to work through professional services to get a lot of things integrated. So I would say to any big corporation or anyone that's really looking to get started is work with professional services. I think it's one of the better teams I've ever had to work with, and we've always been able to get things we've needed or we've asked for in a reasonable amount of time. But definitely know where you want to go. Definitely understand use cases, what customers need. We have people looking at Realm right now. We have people looking at using charts, but we're not quite there yet. Yes, the service is there, but we still have to, again, work on the business rules and how we're going to manage these things. So I would say before opening the floodgates is have that plan of how you're going to manage that scope, because people want everything and they want it now. But that might not be the best course of action.
Mm. Now, you mentioned technical services. Do you have a dedicated technical service person? Do you have someone assigned to your team?
Sure do. His name's Stamati, and anytime we run into any things, he's usually the first person I call. Support's great, but sometimes we just have those issues that have to be addressed right now. And anytime we reach out to our customer advocate, Stamati, he's able to get us in touch with engineers or people that are working directly with those projects. In fact, we were able to connect with Melissa Plunkett, who had a huge piece in bringing in Terraform and Vault, and it was through our customer advocate that we were able to get in touch with her, and we were able to basically bring our issues, our needs, what we've done, and what we'd love to see integrated into the product.
Fantastic. And Melissa is the product manager, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and around that architecture space, it is really important if you're going to be in the infrastructure. If you're going to be in the infrastructure as code game, to stick to your guns, because as soon as you let people in that console and start changing stuff, your infrastructure code is most likely going to break once it starts deviating from what you've deployed. So we've done a pretty good job at Liberty, just as in cloud in general, of sticking to our infrastructure as code guns and only allowing kind of read access into those consoles and the AWS console and the MongoDB Atlas console. So it makes things way better in the long run if we can do that. And there's so much benefit to be able to understand where those changes are coming from, who did them, having a source of truth in your pipeline and repositories and things like that. So that's one thing I would suggest.
Yeah. Speaking of single source of truth, what do you use for change control?
Yeah. So we have a tool called Remedy, which I think is a change control product, and we've built in kind of the standard change into the pipeline, right? So we know that this change goes with this application, and it automatic will log a change every time they run a production deployment.
Well, this was a fantastic episode. Tons of great material that I think our listeners are going to find a lot of value in. Before we wrap up this particular episode, I want to give the two of you a chance to give any kind of shameless plugs about yourself, some stuff that you're working on, your social media handles. This is your opportunity to sell yourself.
Geez, I never really thought about that, but definitely on LinkedIn. Look forward to hearing from people and helping out where I can.
And are you just Brian Poirier on LinkedIn?
On LinkedIn, correct.
Or something else?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Find me at Liberty Mutual, and you'll have a nice picture without a picture of me when I was younger. Yes.
Yep. And you can find me on LinkedIn with my really unique of Brian Jones. And so it should be no problem there. But if you find Liberty Mutual, there's not a whole lot of us at Liberty Mutual, so it should be all right. I do have a Twitter handle, Brian Jones IT, there. Can always reach out there, and more than happy to share our experiences with Atlas with anybody.
Fantastic. And do you gentlemen ever slide into the community forums, MongoDB, community.mongodb.com?
I haven't in a while, but I have gone through there. It's actually a really good resource to interact with other people. But
I would say I've done it selfishly and not done it from a community perspective. So when I have a feature request, I hop out there and put it out there, but probably need to hop in there and help other people out more than I do today.
Great. Well, we're going to hold you to that.
All right.
Well, folks, thanks so much for spending time with us. It's been a great conversation, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. Have a question or a suggestion for the show? Visit us in the MongoDB community forums at community.mongodb.com.